There's a lot of question here. So they're talking about reparations. I assume they're just going to give out cash because I don't know what they're
Well,
else they're
what
going to
does
do.
further than cash mean?
Yeah, so I wanted to actually wonder about what reparations actually look like, because this is not just a story that's happening in Bristol. This is a story that's been bumping around the United States for decades now. And last year there was
If
even
not
a
longer.
there was a Senate hearing in which they're trying to push this through, and they're going to try and push this through with Biden as well to pay reparations. But of course, the problem being that to who and how. So the first one here is talking about the last survivor of the slave trade who was discovered last year. So we have the most recent person. I just found her life actually fairly interesting, so I wanted to talk about it. So she died in Selma, Alabama in January of 1940 at the age of 83. She was the last person who lived who was a slave in her lifetime. So she was captured by slave traders in West Africa at the age of 2 and arrived in Alabama in 1860 on board one of the last transatlantic slave ships. She had come with her mother and had lost her father and 2 brothers left behind in Africa. They hadn't been able to capture them. Presumably the Africans who took them as slaves and then sold them to the Europeans.
Well, literally, we can pretty much be sure that this is the Kingdom of Benin that did this.
Probably yes. Yeah. So
Judging from her geographic location,
it would have been native Africans who make their money from slavery, had gone out, stolen her mother, her and her sister, and brought them to Europeans, and then sold them on for money.
may even have been the Dahomey warrior women.
Yeah. So they lost them. The sisters were again sold off into slavery away from their mother to another owner after a plantation owner had brought them all. And then when she was 7, the Emancipation Proclamation came through and she was freed. But, of course, she didn't have any money, so she just continued working the land where she was, because, I mean, what else are you meant to do?
Yeah.
And what was interesting about her life is she also decided to have a relationship with a white man. So it was a German man who had come over, who was white, and they had a common law marriage, is the wording they use here. Yeah. So not official, but just they were married.
We have common law marriages here.
Yeah. For people who don't know. They also had 14 children, so that's a lot of children to have. In the 1930s, she was in her 70s and made a claim for reparations to the government. And of course, 1930s United States, not interested in hearing it, even though she was legitimately a slave in her lifetime.
So if we can actually locate someone who is deserving of some sort of reparations, it seems to be this woman.
Yeah, but she unfortunately died in 1940, so she was never able to get to a period in which the United States government would take this seriously. What's interesting is also she spent the rest of her life speaking her native language. She wore her hair in the style of the native people. I don't know if I'm saying this right. Yoruba? Something like this. I'm sorry. And she also had face markings, it says, from a rite of passage that they had done, presumably when she was in the plantation.
What rite of passage does a 2-year-old go through?
It doesn't mention. Well, she was 7 by the time she was emancipated. Right. So... And then this is from a group of people who are mostly, still today, living in Nigeria and Benin. Yeah. So almost certainly it would have been the Benin people who did this.
Yeah, it was almost certainly the Kingdom of Dahomey who trafficked her.
Yeah. And so what do you compare this to? Because, of course, the easiest comparison for the United States is to Japanese internment. So if you get the next link, this is a document from 1987, I believe, in which the next year they then passed reparations for Japanese people who were interned during the Second World War. And they say in here that the United States government shall pay out to the fund each individual the sum of $20,000. So that's $46,000 roughly in today's money. It's a good baseline. I mean, these people were imprisoned in internment camps for a few years. I mean, not exactly equal to slavery, let's say, but if you want to start somewhere, that's a good benchmark.
That's at least a number to begin with.
Yeah.
And it's not an unreasonable number either.
It's not extravagant. I mean, you have been mistreated by the government here for several years.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were falsely imprisoned by the state for several years, you'd probably get close to $500,000 or something these days.
Yeah.
So, okay, it's a thing. So, but the conversation about this made up in the Senate, like I said, and there was a weird clip. I watched the whole thing a while back when this first came out of them going through the arguments for and against doing these modern day reparations, because of course they don't know who the hell they're giving it to, because there are no slaves, they're all gone. And I just wanted to play a clip from this. So this is a Democrat who is black and has come to the Senate to argue, we don't need reparations, that's pointless to us, because I'm not a slave, my parents weren't slaves, my grandparents weren't slaves. I mean, you could give them reparations for Jim Crow, because the state mistreated them.
Sure.
But what am I going to do with this? I was born to a wealthy family. I just want to play his argument here, or at least part of it.
In 2008, the House of Representatives formally apologized for slavery and Jim Crow. In 2009, the Senate did the same. Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools.
Oof.
We need a less punitive criminal justice system. We need affordable health care. And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. Nearly everyone close to me told me not to testify today. They told me that even though I've only ever voted for Democrats, I'd be perceived as a Republican and therefore hated by half the country.
I bet that guy went on to vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I imagine he did, to be honest. So he was arguing that this is pointless. What we really need is safer places to live.
Fund the police.
Fund the police and also fund the schooling system, because these are the only ways out of poverty. And he got boos from the congregation, shall we call them there.
We don't like what
leftists.
you say.
Yeah, and he's a Democrat as well. He was like, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I'm a member of the Democratic Party. So what? This doesn't make any sense, because as he points out, you'd be giving it to people like me who live from a rich neighborhood who don't need this money and don't deserve it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even if you hand this all out, I mean, there are going to be people getting it who don't deserve it.
Yeah.
And this congressman here, this Democratic congressman, made the argument in there that there was a promise from an American general during the Civil War of 40 acres and a mule, is what it became known as, that black people would get if they're emancipated. And this isn't a government promise. It was just some
No,
general.
it was the general that made it to try and encourage black runaway slaves to fight for him.
Yeah, so it's not an official thing, but if we want to take it as a standard bearer, we can. And we can
I'm totally in favour of it. I think the American government should have this as their standard policy. They should literally say to black kids from the inner city, we're going to give you 40 acres and a mule in Ohio.
Go for it.
Yeah, go on.
But no one's going to do that.
Exactly. What are they going to do with 40 acres and a bloody mule? Anyway, sorry.
So what do? You have to give it in a cash settlement instead, would be the modern way of doing it. In the same way with your Japanese internment, let's say.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't be able to do anything with 40 acres and a mule either, you know?
Yeah, but so the point also that you can't just give it to a group of people, like black people in the United States, because one of the problems
Kanye
there,
West gets his check in.
well, also just black people in the United States is an incredibly diverse term.
Nigerians who came here 10 years ago.
Trevor
People from
Noah.
Benin who came here 10 years ago.
Does Trevor Noah deserve this money? Does someone who's
Yes.
come from Benin who was a slave deserve this money?
Clearly.
It doesn't make any sense to say black people, because that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the descendants of the victims of slavery. So I went to the United States Agricultural Department's website and just looked up the average price per acre. Apparently it's $4,130. So you times that by 40, you get $165,000 for everyone who was a slave. And it's like, okay, well, Matilda's children were still alive when the article was made. They were in their 70s and 80s. It's like, right, so okay, so that's grandchildren. They're still alive. They have direct link. And let's just say, I mean, Matilda had a lot of children, but let's just say there were 6 grandchildren for every slave, something like this. That would mean that every grandchild of a slave would be given about $27,000. So it's like, well, there you go. You've got 10 years to claim it. If you don't, then that time's up. And you also must show that you are a direct descendant of a literal slave. And it's like, well, okay. There we go. I guess that's what it's going to look like. Maybe it won't be $27,000. Maybe they'll use some other made-up metric to hand out money.
Yeah.
And it's not just that one thing, as I said, the Senate hearing. It's also the Biden administration supports looking into this. And the next link, if you can. So this is the White House were asked about this bill, and they said, yeah, Biden supports looking into a study of how do we do slavery reparations for people who were the descendants of slaves.
Yep.
But the problem, as we've been alluding to the whole time, is, well, it's not as easy as just saying black people. And the no-no that no one likes to mention is that, while the Europeans brought their slaves, they did not capture them in nets. They brought them, and who did they buy them from? Did they buy them from other Europeans?
They didn't even invent the idea of the slave trade.
No. So we brought them from Africans. We would get it from the Africans who were already enslaving people. And the next link here is just I think it's the Anglo-American Journal of 1854. And they're documenting a very interesting meeting in which British diplomats go over to Benin, and they meet the king of Benin, and they're pleading with him to stop the slave trade, because the British were the SJWs of the day, bullying everyone into stop being...
We were busy abolishing the slave trade, yeah?
Yeah, that's what we were up to, which is good. We're proud of
Yeah,
that.
I agree with it.
But it's an interesting meeting, because, of course, he's like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you demanding such things? And I just wanted to read out some extracts from this piece. So they say, "This chief professes great devoutedness to England. He gave notice to European foreigners, quote, that he would not much accustomed to cutting off whiteheads, but if any interfered with an agent of the English government, he would cut off their heads as readily as those of his black people. He seized about 9,000 victims annually and sold about 3,000 of these directly to his own account. He gave the rest away chiefly to his own troops, who sold them. A duty of $5, so about $155 today, was paid on each slave that was exported, affording him altogether, per annum, $300,000, an equivalent today of $9.3 million a year, that this king made from selling his slaves.
It's not even that much, really.
But if you think about it in those days,
Of course.
an African king of all people as well, who's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
running shall we say, like, third world kingdom. I think that's pretty okay to use, leftists. I mean, he's literally being a slaver.
Yeah, are we allowed to say that about African slavers, leftists? You tell us.
I love it. They're going to get offended by the third world part, but oh wait.
Oh, God.
Anyway.
It's the global south.
One of the things I find interesting is his case is not good, but it's not terrible as well. So he goes on to make, and they say he stated the case strongly. Quote, the form of my government cannot be suddenly changed without causing such a revolution as would deprive me of my throne and precipitate the kingdom into anarchy. I am very desirous to acquire the friendship of England. I and my army are ready at all times to fight the Queen's enemies, and we will do anything the English government asks me to do, except give up the slave trade. He will do literally anything for England except give up slavery, because that's literally how the economy works. And he's like, you're asking me to give up all economic growth in my country.
The kingdom will collapse. I'll get my head chopped off.
Yeah, and a lot of people are going to die. And it's like, well, I'm not saying it's good, but you have to think for the guy. It's like, okay. So the British argue back and forth, and they're like, look, you can grow palm oil, you can grow coffee, cotton, these sort of things. And he's like, well, okay, sure, but that takes years to set up. Who's going to pay my men in the meantime? Who's going to deal with this? And I love this quote: "Who will buy the dresses for my wives?"
Well, I mean,
So I'd love to give up the slave trade, lads, but my wife.
yeah, not just that one. I've got a dozen of them, and
Do you know what it's like? Sorry, dadism complaint.
I mean, I that echoes through history.
So he does make the case, and then they sort of make the agreement that they will sort of transfer the economy away from slavery and into growing things instead. And that seems like a reasonable way of dealing with that situation, because the alternative, as he points out, being anarchy, would be undesirable as well. So then he goes on here. The slave trade has been the ruling principle of my people. It is the source of their glory and wealth. Their songs celebrate their victories, and the mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over the enemy reduced to slavery. Can I, by signing such a treaty, change the sentiments of a whole people?
bloody hell.
He's like, this is the glory of my people. This is the thing that defines us. It is the thing that is our economy. Enslaving
And
people.
not just that. Can I change the sentiments of a whole people? That's
It's not just him.
not just him.
The entire country has to be turned on its head for him. And he's like,
Country of black people.
yes. This is not Europeans doing this.
Yes.
So, as I mentioned, they sort of reached an agreement where they were like, okay, well, you need to transfer the economy away from this because we're not putting up with this. And also it's evil.
No, that's right.
But he doesn't think so. He thinks it's the glory. I mean, I think there is something, you can see from his perspective, the glory in conquering a people so badly, and then you turn them all into slaves. I mean, you are the victor in that.
There is definitely a kind of barbaric glory in it.
Yes, there is. And so the agreement was reached that he would do this, but the caveat was that England had proposed to pay him an annual sum for a time as a partial compensation for the loss of his revenue.
It's interesting because this is where the debt from ending the slave trade started really accruing, because we paid, we bought the slavery, the freedom of all these slaves.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the West Africa Squadron, as this example did. We were literally paying African slavers to stop engaging in slavery.
Yeah.
We were
But
just
we
handing
also-
over buckets of treasure.
They always complain that which one was it? It's what some Scottish liberal politician, prime minister, who was the biggest slave trader in Britain, and we obviously had to buy his slaves off him, because we can't just have the government appropriating people's property because they've made a decision. And so we had to pay him money. Obviously, we had to pay the King of Dahomey money, and everyone's complaining, "Oh, you paid the slave traders for their property." Well, it was the legal way to do it.
I mean, we could just steal from them like socialists, but that would
Yeah,
be wrong as well.
yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Obviously, not as wrong as slavery, but still morally wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we
And not
did.
only that, you would have revolutions. You'd have people uprising. To do it peaceably means you have to pay them.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise you have to have a civil war with Americans. So they mention here that the journal are sort of praising this king for, oh my God, he's reached an agreement. And they say, it is a strange, bold, and perilous undertaking that he should direct his disciplined army, his hero, and his heroine battalions to the arts of peace.
See, that's the warrior women there. That's the Amazons.
He's referencing the Amazons, the author of this piece. And in 5 years, he was back to slaving. He was... The economy fell to S, and he was like, right, there's nothing else I can do, and went back to besieging places and trying to get slaves and then sell them off. Unfortunately for him, he then died, and his son carried on the practice of slaving. And then they ran into the problem that the Americans had given up at this point the slave trade, and also the British Navy had turned up and just started freeing every slave that they exported.
Yeah.
So it was no longer profitable for Europeans to go down and buy them.
Yeah.
So
We blockaded all of Brazil at one point because the Portuguese... We're allies with the Portuguese. And so it was just like, stop it. And they were like, no. And they were like, we'll make you stop it. And so we did.
I mean, the same with this guy. The king of Benin was literally like, this is fine. I can't run the economy any other way, so this is how I'm going to do it. And we sent the navy in. And he was like, well, stop. And then what did he do? What did his son do in this case? He was like, fine, I can't export them, but I'm not going to stop slaving.
Well, didn't he... Like you say, that he went over to being pro-French.
Yeah, he went over to the French side because apparently the French had abolished slavery, but they didn't really care if the uncivilized peoples of the world continued it. Unlike the English, who were like bullying everyone into being civilized.
Yeah.
So
How dare you?
So that was one thing he did, and then he got away with this and decided he would just continue internal slavery. So slavery within the Kingdom of Benin continued until the end of the Kingdom of Benin because it was just like, well, that's how we do things. And it exposes how much of this American narrative in which you only see the United States, whites versus blacks, is just bunk. I mean, utter bunk.
If you enjoyed this segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can watch the full broadcast live every weekday at 1 p.m. UK time on lotuseaters.com.